So, the laptop you're using to take this exam right now, it honestly shouldn't even exist.
It really is a logistical miracle when you think about it.
Right. I mean, just to get it onto your desk, some company had to coordinate raw materials from Africa, printed circuit boards from Scotland, drivers from Singapore.
And then, manage the final assembly in Texas.
Exactly.
Mm.
All while navigating dozens of different currencies, geopolitical trade agreements, and vastly different legal systems. We just treat a global transaction like it's as simple as, handing a barista a few dollars for a coffee.
Yeah, but beneath that surface simplicity, there is this invisible, staggering machinery that actually coordinates the modern global economy.
And it's
It
huge.
is the ultimate complex
Yeah.
system. And understanding that machinery, that's really the dividing line between someone who just memorizes business definitions and someone who can actually operate effectively on a global scale.
Which is exactly our mission today. So, to you, the listener, we know you are prepping for your MBA exam on globalization and international business.
Good luck, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. But we're bypassing the dry textbook rote memorization for this deep dive.
Right, because just memorizing bullet points won't actually help you when you face a real complex case study.
Exactly. So we are going to unpack the actual mechanics of global trade, explore the real drivers forcing globalization forward, dissect the shifting macroeconomic data, and evaluate the fierce debates surrounding these multinational strategies.
We want to build a mental framework for you, so solid that when you sit down for that exam, you aren't trying to remember flashcards. You are intuitively thinking like a global manager.
A global manager who understands the why and the how,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. When you look at supply chain disruptions or market entry strategies, you need that systemic view. You have to see the underlying architecture of the world economy.
So to do that, we start by taking a massive step back, like way back.
Way back.
Before we get into digital supply chains or, massive multinational corporations, we have to isolate the most fundamental economic question, which is why do countries even endure the friction of trading with each other in the first place?
And the evolution of trade is, well, it's the perfect starting point for your exam prep. At its core, trade is just a voluntary exchange,
Mm.
right? The buying and selling of goods and services produced elsewhere.
But the earliest version of this, the traditional barter system, it was incredibly restrictive.
Oh, completely, because of the search costs.
Right, because in a barter system, if I have a surplus of wheat and I want a cow, I can't just find anyone with a cow,
No, you have to find someone with a cow who specifically wants your wheat at that exact moment.
which sounds like a nightmare.
It is. In economics, they call that the double coincidence of wants, and it creates this enormous bottleneck. The transaction costs, meaning the time and energy spent just trying to find a willing and matching partner, are just prohibitively high.
So that bottleneck was only bypassed with the introduction of money.
Exactly. Money essentially acts as this universal translation tool for value.
It solves the matchmaking problem. You sell your wheat for currency and then use that currency to buy the cow literally whenever you want.
Right. It provides liquidity, and it drastically lowers those transaction costs. Once that friction was removed, trade wasn't geographically bound to immediate neighbors anymore.
It could scale.
Yeah, it scaled outward, eventually hitting the international level, which created the massive web of interdependence we see today.
Okay, so now for the MBA exam, there's a vital distinction you have to make here regarding friction. We have to clearly separate interregional trade from international trade.
This is a big one.
Yeah, because interregional trade is essentially frictionless. If a company ships, I don't know, oranges from Florida to New York, they're dealing with the same currency, the same federal labor laws, the same language.
And the same central bank.
Right. But the second those oranges cross a national border, the environment fundamentally changes.
It hits a wall. International trade, which involves exports, imports, and multinational corporations, or MNCs, hits a wall of sovereign friction.
You suddenly introduce tariffs.
Tariffs, fluctuating foreign exchange rates, completely different legal frameworks, and geopolitical risk.
So the obvious question is, why endure that friction? If it's so difficult, why even bother crossing the border?
Which brings us to the grandfather of modern economics, Adam Smith, and his theory of absolute advantage. Make sure you have this down for the test.
Absolute advantage. It's basically the bedrock of optimal resource utilization, right?
Yeah. Smith argued that if Nation 1 is highly efficient at producing, say, commodity A, and Nation 2 is highly efficient at producing commodity B. It is totally irrational for them to try and produce both.
They should just each specialize in their most efficient commodity and trade whatever surplus they have.
Exactly.
But wait, what if one nation is just inherently better at producing literally everything than the other nation? Does the trade model just break down?
Well, no. That is where later economists brought in the concept of comparative advantage, which shows that trade still benefits both, even if one is better at everything, basically based on opportunity costs.
Right, right.
But for this foundational framework, Smith's absolute advantage proves the core motivation. Specialization creates a larger global pie.
By focusing on what you do best and trading for the rest, global resources are utilized in the most efficient way possible.
Yeah, and no modern nation, regardless of how big it is willing to just forego the sheer efficiency gains of international trade.
Which brings us to the four specific pillars that actually drive this international trade. If you are taking notes for the exam, this is a core checklist. Pillar 1, difference in natural resources.
Geography completely dictates your economic hand. It's just the physical reality of the planet.
It's like a global potluck, right? Everyone just brings whatever grows in their backyard.
That's a great way to think about it. Geological structures determine where mineral resources are buried. You can't just, will a diamond mine or a lithium deposit into existence within your borders if the geology doesn't support it.
And the same applies to climate. Wool production thrives in cold regions, while commodities like natural rubber or bananas, they require tropical climates.
Right. So if an automaker in a cold weather country needs rubber for tires, they don't have a choice. They absolutely must trade. The diversity of the Earth's surface is the primary catalyst here.
Okay, so moving to the second pillar, we look at the people actually living on that Earth, population factors.
And this isn't just about total headcount. It's about demographics. Demographics fundamentally dictate macroeconomic demand.
Let's really map out the ripple effects of this. How does, an aging population versus a booming young population rewrite a nation's entire import strategy? I mean, why wouldn't a young country and an old country just import the same things, just in different quantities?
Because their foundational life stages require completely different economic inputs. So consider a nation with a massive demographic bulge in the 15 to 35 age bracket.
Okay.
That population is doing three main things. They're entering the workforce, forming new households, and having children.
So their demand curve aggressively skews toward what? Infrastructure.
Infrastructure, raw materials for housing construction, durable goods like cars and appliances, and fast-moving consumer goods.
Whereas an older demographic, say a nation where the median age is in the late 40s or 50s, they've already built their homes. They already bought their durable goods.
Exactly. So their consumption pivots heavily towards specialized services, healthcare infrastructure, pharmaceuticals, and leisure.
Oh, wow. So the young nation imports steel, cement, and manufacturing components, while the aging nation imports medical devices and high-end consumer goods.
You got it. Furthermore, the overall standard of living determines the complexity of those imports. A high-income economy demands immense variety and premium quality.
While a lower standard, developing economy focuses its import capital on just fulfilling basic needs, staple fuels, and essential industrial machinery.
Precisely. So we have the physical resources, we have the demographic demand. The third pillar is the difference in the cost of production.
Which is essentially the engine of arbitrage. I kind of like to think of arbitrage as water flowing down a mountain. Capital and goods will just relentlessly flow toward the path of least resistance and highest margin until the levels equalize.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. Production costs vary wildly across the globe due to labor rates, regulatory environments, and access to capital.
So as long as the cost of transporting a good doesn't totally wipe out the cost savings of producing it somewhere else, businesses are structurally incentivized to buy in the cheaper market and sell in the more expensive one.
Exactly. If it costs $10 to manufacture a widget in country X, and consumers are willing to pay $50 for it in country Y, businesses will build a bridge between those two nations.
Provided the toll on that bridge isn't $41.
Right, which perfectly introduces the fourth and final pillar, transportation cost. The history of international trade is practically a mirror reflection of the evolution of transport technology. They are inextricably linked.
Because, historically, high transport costs acted as a massive physical tariff. The cost to move average goods over oceans by wind or over land by animal was so exorbitant that trade was heavily restricted.
It limited trade almost entirely to high-value luxury items, gems, silk, spices. You only traded items where the final profit margin was massive enough to absorb that astronomical transportation cost.
But then we see spatial expansion unlocked by technology. The expansion of rail, the shift to steam and diesel ocean transport, air freight.
But there was one technological leap that often gets ignored in favor of engines, and that is preservation.
Oh, refrigeration.
Yes, refrigeration literally changed the map. It transformed the nature of what could be traded. Suddenly, a perishable good like beef from Argentina could be shipped to Europe without spoiling.
The spatial boundaries of agricultural trade just vanished.
They evaporate.
So, synthesizing this first section for you, the listener. Nations endure the friction of international trade to avoid the high transaction costs of barter, to capture the efficiency gains of absolute advantage, and to capitalize on varying natural resources, shifting demographics, and the profit margins of arbitrage made possible by plunging transportation costs.
That perfectly encapsulates the foundational mechanics.
Yeah.
But understanding the baseline of trade only really brings us up to the mid-20th century. For your MBA exam, you have to understand how these basic trade principles mutated into the hyper-integrated high-speed phenomenon we call globalization.
Right, so let's define that term clearly. Globalization is the increasing integration of countries around the world, characterized by the accelerated cross-border movement of goods, services, finance, ideas, and human capital.
It isn't just about shipping physical crates anymore. It is the integration of systems.
So to operationalize this for an exam setting, we need to bifurcate globalization into its two primary corporate strategies, the globalization of markets and the globalization of production.
They are distinct, and you absolutely must know the difference. Let's start with the globalization of markets.
This is the demand side, right?
Yes, this is the expansion of access, allowing businesses to sell their final goods and services to customers all over the world, which leads to a massive interdependency among global economies.
And the quintessential example here from the text is the standardization of the consumer experience. Think of McDonald's.
The globalization of markets implies that a consumer can access a deeply similar branded experience, whether they are walking into a location in Paris, New Delhi, or Tokyo.
They tailor the specific menu to local cultural tastes, of course, but the underlying product, the operational efficiency, the branding, the hygiene standards, it's a globally standardized commodity.
This creates immense variety and competition in local markets, which theoretically increases consumer welfare. But there is a vital strategic implication here that an MBA student really must grasp.
What's that?
In a world where markets are this integrated, technological isolation is impossible.
Meaning, if your company invents a groundbreaking new process or product, you can't just rely on geographic isolation to protect your monopoly.
No, the information spreads instantaneously. Your competitors in Asia or Europe will reverse engineer and copy your tech almost immediately.
Therefore, speed to market becomes the ultimate competitive advantage. You must capitalize on your discoveries and establish market share globally before the fast followers can match you.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is that this isn't just a game for corporate giants anymore.
Right, I noticed that in the text. In the globalization of markets, physical size is no longer a barrier to entry. Even small companies can create global products.
A three-person software startup can launch an application today and have paying customers in 60 countries by tomorrow morning. The digital infrastructure has completely leveled the distribution playing field.
Okay, so that is the demand side. The flip side of the coin is the globalization of production.
This is where businesses treat the entire world as a singular global village from which to source diverse skills, techniques, and low-cost labor.
If the first was about selling everywhere, this is about building everywhere. And the case study you need to internalize for this, crucial for memory, is the Dell PC model.
It is a masterpiece of supply chain orchestration. Dell maintains a single, centralized headquarters in Round Rock, Texas. But they do not manufacture their computers there.
No, they operate a staggering production network spanning 34 different countries. They treat the globe like a giant parts bin, optimizing for the lowest cost and highest efficiency in every single category.
The printed circuit boards are sourced from facilities in Asia, Scotland, and Eastern Europe.
The drivers come from Singapore. The monitors are imported from specific Asian and European manufacturers. The box builds and chassis are built in Ireland and Asia.
Consider the managerial bandwidth required to just maintain that. You are intentionally exposing your supply chain to extreme vulnerability.
Right, because a port strike in Singapore or a currency devaluation in Eastern Europe, or even a sudden change in environmental regulations in Scotland could shut down your entire assembly line in Texas.
You are trading supply chain resilience for ultimate cost efficiency. They only do the final assembly in their domestic market, which allows them to custom configure the laptops right before shipping to the end consumer.
It's brilliant arbitrage. But there is a massive paradigm shift on the horizon regarding this model, which is a real aha moment in the text.
And this is where a strong MBA student looks ahead. The traditional globalization of production assumes that human labor is the primary variable cost.
You shift production to developing nations because the wages are lower.
But what happens to that math when the production process becomes fully automated?
Oh, wow. If an assembly line is run entirely by robotics and AI, the cost of human labor effectively drops to zero.
Exactly. And if labor costs are no longer the deciding factor, it makes zero economic sense to manufacture your goods thousands of miles away from your end consumer and pay astronomical shipping costs.
So we are facing a future where production might rapidly shift back to developed economies. You build the automated mega factory in Texas or Germany right next to your primary consumer base.
It completely flips the Dell model on its head.
Which brings us to a massive question. Coordinating parts from 34 countries, maintaining real-time digital sales globally. None of this was happening in 1970. What specific forces suddenly unlocked this hyper-integrated global village over the last 4 decades?
The integration was propelled by 4 distinct engines, or drivers. The first, predictably, is technological drivers.
But it's not just computers, right? It's the liberalization of the telecommunications sector. It's the internet.
Yes, the laying of underwater fiber optic cables that allowed instantaneous data transfer. E-commerce platforms that allowed businesses in developing nations to bypass the physical constraints of time and geography.
And microprocessors just made computing so incredibly cheap. Suddenly, complex logistical software that used to require a massive mainframe could run on a desktop.
Which made global supply chain management accessible to mid-sized firms. So that handles the data. But the physical goods still have to move.
Which introduces the second driver, and frankly, one of the most underappreciated inventions in human history. Containerization. The physical internet.
The intermodal shipping container completely revolutionized global freight.
I always compare the shipping container to the standard USB port on a computer.
Oh, that's a brilliant analogy.
Right, because before the USB, every keyboard, mouse, and printer had a different proprietary plug. It was a chaotic nightmare to connect systems. The USB created a universal standard that allowed any device to talk to any computer.
And the shipping container did the exact same thing for the physical world. Prior to containerization, shipping relied on break bulk cargo.
Longshoremen basically manually loaded individual sacks of coffee, wooden crates of machinery, and barrels of oil into the holds of ships.
It was incredibly labor-intensive. It took weeks to load a single vessel, and theft and damage were just rampant.
But the intermodal container created a standardized, uniform geometry, standardized dimensions that can be stacked, loaded, and seamlessly transferred.
Because the dimensions are identical globally, the handling process shifted from labor-intensive to capital-intensive. The entire global supply chain was rebuilt around that specific steel box.
Massive mechanized cranes lift them from ships. They drop directly onto standardized rail flat cars. They lock perfectly onto the chassis of semi-trucks.
And crucially, the cargo is seamlessly transferred between these modes of transport without ever being opened. There's computer tracking for everything now.
So the friction at the ports just evaporated. Shipping times plummeted, congestion cleared, damages lessened, and the sheer cost of moving a ton of goods across an ocean dropped so drastically post-World War II that it made Dell's 34-country supply chain economically viable.
But technology and physical containers aren't enough if governments refuse to let the goods in. This requires our third driver, the decline of trade barriers and the rise of global institutions.
Because in the wake of World War II, the international community realized that aggressive, protectionist trade policies like crippling tariffs and quotas had exacerbated the Great Depression and fueled global conflict.
They needed a system, a pressure release valve. They needed a rule book. Thus began the era of global institutional architecture.
For your exam, you need to recognize the key players here. You have CATC, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, and regional blocs like the EU, ADB, SAARC, UNCTAD, and the UN.
But more importantly, you need to understand their mechanisms. Let's look at the mechanism of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. It doesn't just encourage trade, it acts as an arbitrator.
So if country A believes country B is unfairly subsidizing its steel industry and destroying country A's domestic market, country A doesn't just go to war or launch a unilateral embargo.
No. They take the case to the WTO. The WTO mediates, reviews the trade laws, and if a violation occurred, authorizes country A to implement retaliatory tariffs. It is a structured legal system for resolving sovereign economic disputes.
Similarly, the IMF functions to maintain global financial stability. If a developing nation faces a severe balance of payments crisis and can't afford to import essential goods or service its foreign debt,
The IMF steps in as a lender of last resort, providing liquidity in exchange for structural economic reforms.
so these entities systematically deregulated markets, negotiated down global tariffs, and created a stable environment where foreign direct investment, or FDI, could flow freely across borders.
Which culminates in the fourth driver, cost and competitive pressures. Because the technology exists, because shipping is practically free, and because the legal barriers are down, multinational firms are forced to compete on a global stage.
It's an arms race of efficiency. If your competitor figures out how to leverage this global system to cut their production costs by 30%, you have to match them or you go out of business.
Companies are forced to innovate and distribute faster than ever, relying on high two-way trade and constant foreign investment just to survive.
So these drivers have completely rewritten the rules of the game. Now, for the MBA student looking at the big picture, what does the scoreboard look like today? Who is actually winning in this new globalized economy?
This requires us to look at the changing world order, the data, demographics, and power shifts. And the data tells a staggering story. In the mid-20th century, global economic power was highly concentrated in what was known as the Triad, the United States, Western Europe, and Japan.
But the first decades of the 21st century triggered a massive paradigm shift. We witnessed the meteoric rise of emerging markets, most notably the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Let's focus on the massive changes over time here. In 1960, the United States was the undisputed economic heavyweight, commanding nearly 40% of the entire world's GDP.
Half a century later, by 2010, that share had nearly been cut in half, down to roughly 22.7%.
During that exact same period, China's share of global GDP exploded from a mere 4.3% in 1960 to 9.2% by 2010.
And the export data is even more dramatic. China skyrocketed to the point where they officially replaced Germany as the world's largest exporter in 2010.
But the emerging markets aren't just satisfied with being the world's factory floor anymore. The data shows that the combined research and development budgets of China and India now exceed the R&D budgets of both the United States and Europe.
Wow. Which really contrasts the optimism, future-driven youth, and heavy investments in science and tech in emerging markets against, say, Western Europe's concerns about pension sustainability.
Exactly. This economic shift is heavily underpinned by changing demographics. To understand where the future economic power lies, you have to look at where the human capital is concentrated.
So if we look at the top 10 most populous countries, China, India, the US, Indonesia, Brazil, Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Russia, and Japan, an incredible reality emerges.
Only 2 of those 10, the US and Japan, represent the old 20th century triad. The vast majority of the human race resides in emerging markets.
And while the absolute number of people on Earth continues to rise, the rate of population growth is actually slowing down, right?
Yes. The world population growth rate declined from 1.49% in 1950 to 1.13% in 2009. This is largely due to rising marriage ages and increased access to contraceptives.
But for an MBA student, the total headcount is less important than the dependency ratio, the working population bonus.
Let's unpack the dependency ratio because this is crucial. It's the ratio of the working age population, typically defined as ages 15 to 64 compared to the non-working population, which includes children and the elderly.
When a country experiences a surge in its 15 to 64 demographic, it enters a period known as the demographic dividend.
Because suddenly you have a massive army of people generating output, earning wages, and crucially saving money, with relatively few dependents draining public resources.
The global data on this is wild. From 1960 to 2014, the global share of the working age population rose from 58% to over 65.6%.
This demographic dividend boosts prosperity, provided, and this is a big provided, the right policies and institutions are in place to actually employ those young people.
The overall output of that global engine is staggering. For your exam, remember these GDP data points. From 1960 to 2015, global GDP per capita jumped from roughly $3,066 to over $8,010.
But here's the most important data point regarding globalization. While annual GDP growth actually slowed down from 4.3% in 1961 to 2.5% in 2014, global trade absolutely exploded.
Right. In 1960, global trade as a percentage of world GDP was just 25%. By 2010, it had soared to 57.2%.
Think about what that means. Trade grew significantly faster than the economy itself. Nations aren't just growing independently, they're rapidly intertwining.
And the ultimate expression of that intertwining is foreign direct investment, or FDI.
Let's define the mechanics of FDI. This isn't just a company exporting laptops to a foreign country. This is a company taking its capital and actively purchasing or building physical assets in another sovereign nation.
We categorize it into outward and inward direct investment. Outward FDI is when your domestic firm expands abroad.
Imagine a German automaker. If they export cars to the U.S., they face shipping costs, potential import tariffs, and massive currency risk. So they execute an outward FDI. They spend $1 billion to build a massive manufacturing plant in South Carolina.
And for the United States, that exact same transaction is classified as inward FDI. Host countries desperately compete for inward FDI because it boosts economic growth, infrastructure, and tax revenues.
The global trend line for FDI is a massive testament to integration. Global FDI skyrocketed from $10.17 billion in 1970 to nearly $3 trillion in 2007.
But then the data shows a massive hit due to the 2008-2009 global financial crisis.
Which serves as a stark reminder of the systemic vulnerability of this model. When the global banking system seized up, capital retreated.
So we've brought it all together. You, the listener, now know why nations trade, how the system integrated the physical tech that moves it, and the data showing who holds the power.
The final piece of the MBA puzzle is applying this to actual business management and navigating the fierce debates surrounding these systems, the managerial reality.
The scope of international business is incredibly broad. At one end of the spectrum, you have a company simply importing or exporting with no foreign investment.
And at the other extreme, you have massive conglomerates with subsidiaries worldwide and decentralized decision-making.
The managerial headache is incomprehensible. Dealing with different cultures, political structures, legal systems, and economic development levels. It requires mastery in marketing, HR, supply chain, and finance across borders.
And on top of all the operational friction, the modern global manager must navigate the globalization debate.
And as a future MBA, you must understand both sides of this debate impartially. It affects consumer sentiment, policy, and corporate strategy. You cannot afford to be an ideologue. Let's start with the pros. What is the argument for globalization?
The primary benefits from the text include greater access to global markets and tech. It facilitates tech transfer from developed to underdeveloped nations.
There are trickle-down economic effects via government tax collection, increased purchasing capability, and small firms gaining global reach through ICT.
But we must rigorously balance this with the cons. The critics raise profound structural concerns. The first major critique is that globalization raises inequalities within and between nations.
Massive multinational corporations dominate, prioritizing profit over consumer welfare.
Then there is the volatility of capital flows. Like we saw in 2008, weak financial institutions in underdeveloped nations can crash due to sudden banking or currency crises.
And the environmental degradation when production is shifted to poorer nations with lax laws, plus the cultural impact traditional unique cultures risk being erased by westernization.
So as a future global manager, let me pose a direct challenge. How do you reconcile the efficiency of the Dell model, sourcing from 34 countries, with the valid critiques of environmental harm and cultural erosion?
It's the defining tension of the 21st century MBA. Modern management isn't just about arbitrage anymore. It's about sustainable, culturally sensitive integration.
Exactly. You have to build supply chains that are resilient and ethical, because failing to do so is an existential business risk today.
So let's run through a quick, high-energy recap of the mental framework we've built for your exam. We tracked the barter to globalization evolution.
We applied Adam Smith's absolute advantage to understand why nations specialize.
We outlined the 4 reasons for trade: natural resources, demographics, production costs, and transportation.
We dissected Dell's global production versus McDonald's global markets.
We celebrated the unsung heroism of the shipping container, the shifting power dynamics of the BRICS nations, and the nuanced pros and cons of the globalization debate.
You now possess a comprehensive systemic view of international business. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to ponder that builds on a passing comment in the text.
I'm ready.
If advancements in robotics and automation make human labor costs irrelevant, causing multinational companies to pull their manufacturing out of developing nations and to bring it back home, What happens to those emerging economies whose entire growth model relies on being the global village's cheap labor force?
Oh, wow.
Will kicking away that ladder spark an entirely new era of deglobalization?
That is a completely reshaped global map, a profound strategic question to explore on your own. To you, the learner, we wish you the absolute best of luck on your MBA exam. You are no longer just memorizing definitions, you have the deep systemic understanding required to ace it. You are ready. Until next time, thanks for taking the deep dive.